Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelancer writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video review series where I take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. This video, I'll be reviewing the DM's Guild rulebook Masque of the Red Death Player's Guide by Jeremy Forbing, Anthony Joyce, and BJ Hensley for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my videos, consider using my affiliate links for your DM's Guild shopping and supporting me via patreon.com/roguewatson. Shouts to my platinum patrons, Andrew, Richard, Joe, Will, Tiny Dancer, Nick, Andy, and Chris. And gold patrons, RPG Papercrafts, Charming Grenade, Pretty Boy, Numa, Marcos, David Vicente, Gilberto, Sean, A.K., Cert 2B, Adam, Dead Lizard Lounge, Sam, Ross, Lumpy Spuds, and Jerome. Thank you all very much for your support. I really wish I had read through the Masque of the Red Death Player's Guide before I had reviewed Red Jack, a Gothic Earth adventure, last year, as that was my first foray into what Gothic Earth is. From what I understand, this is a campaign setting that was spun out of the Ravenloft campaign setting, which is a fantasy Gothic setting for D&D. Gothic Earth basically takes that concept and applies it to I think what we would refer to it as urban horror or urban fantasy. But it basically is our real world, but there's obviously supernatural shit going on. Although it's also a period piece. So it's also, and that's the Gothic part of it, is basically turn of the century, late 19th, early 20th century, around, 1890, 1900s. I think it's the Red Dead Redemption time period, but with usually Victorian London instead of in the Old West. And Masque of the Red Death Player's Guide is basically a combination player's handbook and dungeon master's guide for the Gothic Earth setting. It's over 100 pages long. It is extremely comprehensive. It's very well organized, well written, well edited, a absolutely beautiful layout. I love the black and white images that are included everywhere. It provides 5 character classes that are completely new and different because you can't just take, a traditional like monk and sorcerer into the real world of basically Earth, but about 100 some years ago. You could maybe take some of the enemies, and the idea is because D&D 5e is so malleable and made to be moddable, then you can just apply these rules into 5e. So this was a setting that was initially released, I believe, in the 90s. It's forward mentions 25 years ago, and I am one of those that just thinks the 80s was like 15 years ago, so none of this quite lines up for me. But and it's named after the original boxed release, which was Masque of the Red Death. So I'm extremely impressed with this rule book. It does everything mechanically that I want it to do, which is give me the classes and the subclasses, the backgrounds, the equipment, how firearms work, and all that kind of stuff, as well as rules about all the new rules. So you've got dark powers. You've got new skills. Resting and healing work a lot differently here. Devastating injuries, which I actually use in my campaign as I think it's lasting injuries, which you can accrue if you basically go down to 0 hit points. It's like a penalty for falling, even if you're going to get back up afterwards. The fact that everybody can cast spells, but you could be corrupted from that. There's just a lot of really neat things, and it smartly includes, there's an opening chapter about what Gothic Earth is, which is a Victorian setting with vampires and Frankenstein's monster and all that good stuff. And then it goes into basically what the player's handbook does, which is breaking down how does character creation work, but it smartly puts all the new rules up in front in its own section, because you can safely assume at this point anybody reading this is going to be familiar with D&D 5e. And especially now in 2020 when 5e is like 5 or 6 years old by now, even longer if you count the D&D Next test run. So I think that's a really good way of organizing it. You can assume everybody knows how to play 5e. They've already got that rule book. They already know the basic rules. So instead, you just explain what are the differences between how 5e works versus how Gothic Earth works. And it's a very specific amount of differences. There are, madness checks to worry about. There's ritual spell casting because everybody can cast spells, but only ritual spells. But if you cast spells, then you have a chance of being corrupted by dark powers, because the whole backstory of Gothic Earth is this Red Death entity exists that has corrupted magic and made it so that magic is a wholly bad, evil thing in the universe. And that's why it's always, into the dark, occult, and all that shit is. And it's why it explains why evil is magic is evil in quote unquote our universe versus something like Forgotten Realms where everybody can use magic all the time. So it's kind of a neat little backstory to that. The way it can resolve points work, you can use resolve to basically not succeed on saving throws, but give yourself another chance at them, or use that to bolster your armor class, or basically it's some way to separate the fact that your player characters are above and beyond and kind of designed to repel these threats, but at the same time they're never designed to basically be the D&D like superheroes that they end up becoming in 5th edition. In fact, it even mentions that all of the rules included on here only go up to 10th level, and that is on purpose because you're not supposed to really run these games with characters beyond 10th level. And I think that's the designers basically admitting that like at some point in D&D you become just superhero and godlike in tier 3 and tier 4 compared to the average like human being. And you would basically it basically says you should retire once you reach that level, because now you're basically in charge of your own, now you're instead of being the Wolverine of the group, now you're the Professor X of the group. Like you can basically start your own team up because you're just so super powerful. You don't really have to deal with these, put yourself in harm's way, put others in harm's way. Just create a pyramid scheme, basically, is the eventual retirement plan for all heroes, or die. Most likely, it even says you're probably gonna actually die on your way here. You can see these really cool artwork. On the one hand, yeah, it'd be cool to get like full color, nice, lovely art, but I actually think this is very thematic and fitting. It's very much that horror art. It's kind of that Stephen Gamble, scary stories to tell in the dark style, where it's all kind of abstracted but horrific in its own fun way. I can't go through all 100 pages here, but I will kind of break down briefly. Chapter 2 is all about the new classes. We get 5 of them. Most of them are direct analogs to 5e's classes. To pull up my notes, but I believe so the Scion is basically a cross between a warlock and a wizard. The Shepherd is basically just a bard, and in fact it's even more obvious than that. Like they even have, like, where's the bards? Oops, did I skip Shepherd? Scion has a lot of pages. Scion has all these forbidden lore, which basically works like the warlock invocations, but also every class gets specialized feats, which is pretty cool. There's a shepherd. So the shepherd, instead of having bardic inspiration, has intuitive inspiration and that kind of thing. The sleuth is a rogue, so instead of sneak attack, he's got precision damage. It's pretty close. The soldier is basically a fighter, and the stalwart is mainly a monk, although a little bit of barbarian in there with that. You're just kind of a big, strong person. But the one cool thing that they all have are these specialized feats, which is something that I think, which I like, because that's one of the coolest things about being a warlock, is you get those cool invocations that are just for you, that you can pick from this specialized list of things. And the designers basically did that for all of these classes. So everybody, even not just the Scion, everybody gets their own specialized feats that allow them to basically further customize your character. So a sleuth, you can have a detective, you could be a detective, a diplomat, a performer, a physician, a mechanic, just basically all these skills that kind of represent the rogue's version of, knowing all these various skills, and just kind of adds that as a cool like background like trait. Like, how did you pick up these skills and how they actually manifest in game mechanics, which I think is a really neat thing. Now, notice none of these have subclasses yet. So it's just the base class, but they do mention having archetypes. And I was really confused reading this. I was like, all right, well, why is the archetypes a different chapter? And why isn't that just, expanded on in each class? That's kind of really annoying. And then I immediately, once I got to the archetype, realized, oh, this is why. Because archetypes have been divorced from the classes, which is really interesting. And if you notice by the names, a lot of them are pulled from backgrounds from 5e, stuff like Outrider, Spy, Criminal, Charlatan. I believe those are literally name for name backgrounds used in the background chapter of the player's handbook in 5e. So in this case, they are combination backgrounds and subclasses, and they can be used for any class. So you could be a Scion Outrider, or you could be a Soldier Mystic, a soldier who just happens to be haunted by ghosts. I think that's really cool to open that up, and that really frees up the ability to create whatever exact custom class you want, which is important because there's only 5 classes to work with. So with only 5 classes, you want to be able to customize those to the best of your ability if you end up playing through, with multiple characters and having multiple party members and everything. And this goes a long way towards making each one, you've got your specialized feats, which are nice, but you could also be, a sleuth pugilist or a sleuth expert or a sleuth criminal. So I think that really adds a lot. And they're not just the stupid, background features. I love 5e, but the backgrounds are such a wasted opportunity in 5e. All of those, abilities that you can forge somebody's handwriting or whatever that people get at level 1 because of their background and then never remember for the rest of their existence, pretty much. I think the only one that ever comes into play is like Acolyte, because you can get like free, healing services or something, and that one's more important than most of them. In this case, though, they add, it's the character specific, it's the subclass ability. So you gain one at 3rd level, at 6th level, and 9th level, and 1st level. So you get all these different abilities. Sometimes they just add like different skills, but a lot of times it is actual mechanics that you can use, which is really fun. Outrider kind of makes you like a part ranger, basically. Gives you a lot of terrain abilities. Gunslinger, of course, gives you extra abilities to use with weapons. Medium allows you to like detect spirits, kind of like the paladins. Divine Sense. So they're way more than just the backgrounds, which I like. However, there are also backgrounds. In this case, in Gothic Earth, the backgrounds are your wealth. So you can go and it uses the wealth from the Dungeon Master's guide. From I believe there's 7 different levels, from basically completely destitute to you're part of the aristocracy, and that gives you however much starting money you have, as well as a background. And it does make an effort to balance it, because why wouldn't you just choose, I was fucking born wealthy, but you do get a better mechanical benefit if you start off poor. And there is a nice sidebar, a series of sidebars throughout this entire rule book that basically explains, hey, consent is important. Talking about whenever, especially when consent's important anyway, regardless, full stop. But when you've got something that is steeped in theme with madness and mental anguish, and sanitariums are like a big theme, and horror and fear and all these kind of elements, especially when you're literally, in this real world setting. So you can't even use the like, oh, we're in a fantasy world. Like, no, this is really supposed to be our world. Granted, it's supposed to diverge. There's obviously magic around, but I do appreciate that there are sidebars here that basically explain all these things. This is something that I think you would not see, how, for example, if this were written in like 2004. I don't think there would even be a thing about trying to explain, poverty is not a superpower, and explains that, like, look, this is a matter of game design and attempting to balance things out, and not the fact that we think poor people have their head on a swivel and thus get advantage to dexterity. Like, that's not, that is not at all what they're trying to say here. So I do appreciate that. And I kind of skipped through, but there are some really good sidebars that kind of confirm all that and basically explain, hey, here's how, all these things really work. And I appreciate that. I do. And then we get to wealth, equipment, and weapons. That's pretty much obvious. You can expect there. But notice how just it's really well laid out. It's really well organized. Again, it smartly looks at the player's handbook and decides, here's the tables we're going to use. Here's the color scheme we're going to use. Although notice it doesn't use the brown parchment paper stuff. It uses its own black and white color scheme with this really cool like skull and hands border. I think it looks fantastic while also still being very laid out, which I which I appreciate. I want to skip ahead to let's see. Cabals is an interesting. It's mostly Player's Handbook. I would say about 2/3 Player's Handbook and 1/3 Dungeon Master's Guide. And the 1/3 Dungeon Master's Guide is probably the Cabals and the there's actually a whole chapter on just being a Dungeon Master's workshop. Cabals could be useful for players if you want to specifically be part of a cabal. And a cabal is basically a reverse cult. It is a hidden group of not Illuminati, but like just a secret. Every time I try to describe something that sounds cultish, but like a secret group who are like an Avengers team, I guess, or an X-Men or something. You kind of live on the periphery and you are fighting the forces of evil. So although there are evil cabals, obviously, but and it explains that they're basically just called cults. But cabals are basically good ones. So, for example, they'd be founded by like Van Helsing or Merlin, or they were associated with like the Salem witch trials because they were, unjustly tried to be destroyed by dark forces, corrupting humankind. So there's a bunch that are listed, and then there are a few that are given some more expansive notes that you could actually use, and they're given their own spells because there's a certain forbidden lore you can take that basically allows you to be initiated into a cabal, or a dungeon master could just make a cabal part of the campaign. So it's a really neat chapter because it adds a lot of depth and storytelling to the Gothic Earth, which is the one thing that's kind of, well, there's, I guess, one more thing I'll talk about, but there is one thing that is lacking in this book. It is not a campaign, it is not a setting guide, or it is not a source book, which is important. And the designers make that distinction with like the very first sentence of the foreword. Is like, this is not a source book. It's not meant to detail all the rise and history of the Gothic Earth and all that. It is a rules book to allow you to play in that setting. So all this other stuff is basically bonus to creating part of a character's backstory. Now, that being said, there is, as I mentioned, an entire chapter on how to run certain things for the dungeon master's point of view. So everything was very player focused up until here. Cabals could kind of overlap between the both of them. And this is where you really get into the nitty gritty. Okay, how do we use madness? What are the detriments that you can be afflicted with? What is the dark power system is so cool. So every time somebody casts a spell of first level or greater, they have to roll a check against being corrupted by dark powers. And if they are corrupted, then all these different stages happen. It's usually a really cool way of like a demonic entity basically trying to talk a player into, helping them, but at the cost of they are slowly going to be turned into a monster, which is really neat. And it's fascinating because the different stages are like, you get free magic items, you just get free bonus rolls. It's pretty neat, but I think you get free spells you can cast. So they're very powerful, but at the cost that eventually, the end result is you become a villainous NPC. So that could be like the full character arc for your characters. If you keep accepting these dark powers and you be corrupted by them, eventually you just have to hand your character sheet into the DM because you're like, look, your character's become straight evil now, and now they could come back to harass the players. And like stage 6 is like you've become like a equivalent of a Count Dracula or something. Like you've just become a super monstrous evil entity, which is really, really cool. So I think it's a fantastic system. It's really neat. It's cool because it goes back and forth between the DM and the player, because I think the player in the most stages, they do have to make that check, but they do kind of have the ability to, repel the dark influence to an extent, but it's also up to them whether they want to keep doing it. So it's a really, really cool system and helps make Gothic Earth a lot more unique than a lot of other different D&D systems, and it's very thematic to the fact that magic is fucking evil in this universe. Everybody can use magic, but with the caveat that there's always a chance you will be ultimately corrupted by it. There's rules on role-playing and doing social combat maneuvers because and a lot of systems are like this that aren't D&D, but use D&D's system, which is D&D is a very combat-heavy game. Almost every single rule in D&D revolves around combat. Think about every, ability and skill characters earn throughout their leveling up process is almost all combat related. So it does have notes on the fact that, hey, look, Gothic Earth, it's a lot of investigation. It's a lot of talking to people. It's, it's kind of Call of Cthulhu-esque in that way. And there are even notes about what are the difference between Gothic Earth and a cosmic horror setting. These are all really, really good stuff to have. The one thing that's missing, so I did mention the other thing, which is there's no adventure material or any of that. But the one thing that's missing from a rulebook standpoint is there's not really anything good on magic items, which, magic items aren't really, I believe, included in the player's handbook. It's more of a dungeon master's guide thing, but this is the dungeon master's chapter. And the whole thing on magic items is literally contained to this few paragraphs right here. And it even mentions every magic item is unique. They are not very common. This is not D&D where there's +1 swords everywhere. This is like, you find a magic item and it's a super powerful, crazy rare, artifact essentially. But that's why I want magic items, because they're so unique, they're so interesting. I can't just pull up the Dungeon Master's Guide, flip through, the middle pages and pull out a magic item. I would have really liked to see, ideally like a dozen or so sample items. We get one, which is this very haunting, cool pipe organ. And I would have loved to have more of those, at least a handful. I would have killed for like a dozen of those, would have really fleshed it out and given me a nice okay, here are some example magic items, especially because they're all supposed to be cursed in some way, which I'm always in favor of. If you give somebody an item, give it to have it some kind of detriment or some kind of risk reward to using it. I do like that concept a lot. Instead of just saying, hey, give somebody an item, but make sure you don't give it to them too much. And also look up the minor detrimental property table in the Dungeon Master's Guide. That's basically all the notes we get for magic items. So I found that super disappointing for how otherwise exhaustive and comprehensive all the other rules have been up until then. So that's a little bit of a bummer. And then the final, that was it for chapters. We do get an appendix. I really like Appendix C, which is almost like board games do this, but it's like a quick sheet of all the basic things you need to know. For example, a board game will include like, here are the player actions you can take on your turn as a little card. And this is like the rulebook version of that, which is at the end of the rulebook, it says, hey, here are all the important things. Now that you've just read everything and probably forgotten half of it, here are the important rules that are the difference between 5e. And if you're coming from 5e, here's all the new shit you need to know to adapt everything into Gothic Earth, which is amazing. That's awesome. And it's indicative of how just well organized and laid out this whole thing is, that it had the foresight to say, hey, we can put everything you need to know in 2 pages as a quick summary. And then obviously you need to look up detailed rules and other things. I also really like the one piece of lore we get is kind of a bonus appendix here, which is the setting of Gothic London. So it's not super, it doesn't have like adventure hooks or things of that nature, which is a bit of a bummer. There's a little bit here in the Forbidden Lore section. It more talks about like Sherlock Holmes and kind of what his status is. But it does provide like a background information about what London looks like, what are some areas in London, in case you just don't really know anything about the setting and the time period. Then it does give you some background information there. It's not super long, and that's not what this book is. It is a rules book first, but I do appreciate that we're giving this as a bonus look at, a background information for running your own campaign, because after reading this, it's Gothic Earth is pretty damn cool, and it's pretty exciting, and I think this is an incredibly impressive product. All right, pros and cons for Masque of the Red Death Player's Guide. Pro: it is an extremely well-organized rule book, including the appendix summary of new rules. Absolutely well laid out, easy to read, no grammatical errors whatsoever. Very impressive. Pros: specialized feats for an additional layer of character customization for each class. I really like that concept of giving every class multiple things to choose from. Backgrounds that are modified as effective classless archetypes. The archetypes from the base 5e are a good the background, are a good idea, but ultimately unfulfilling rules-wise. And I think modifying those backgrounds, as well as adding some new ones, into character archetypes and essentially subclasses is an excellent and really effective way of making characters that much more unique. Pro: sidebars that emphasize the seriousness of consent, horror, madness, and real-world analogs. That's very nice to have. Pros: corrupting dark powers as an interesting risk-reward consequence, including eventually becoming an NPC villain. Probably my single favorite rules concept in the entire guide. Pro: DM notes and rules for social combat, role-playing, magic items, and optional feats. And pros: details on Gothic London as a campaign setting. I don't know, but that may be the most amount of pros I've ever had on a single item I have reviewed on the DM's Guild. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Somebody will be able to go back and see which one, if anything, has gotten that many, but that's got to be one of the best. And my only con is about the magic items. I was disappointed that we didn't get some sample magic items, or at least maybe some more like its own table for creating curse charts or something to be more involved with magic items. I know they're not supposed to be very common in this universe, but at least something would have really tied the whole thing together and made it so I wouldn't have any complaints whatsoever. Final verdict: a combination of Player's Handbook and Dungeon Master's Guide, Masque of the Red Death Player's Guide should be the primary resource for introducing and playing in the delightfully dark world of Gothic Earth. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson. And you can follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. Thank you.